inspectors put forth a Herculean effort to identify the origin of the anthrax spores contained in the mailings, and together with career prosecutors from the Department of Justice, prepared to bring the person responsible for these crimes to justice. The Amerithrax task force members worked tirelessly on a case that quickly became a global investigation spanning 6 continents and required that new scientific techniques be created. Postal inspectors, FBI agents, analysts, and scientists worked this investigation 24/7 with unwavering dedication and perseverance. For example, at the time of the anthrax attacks, the protocols for genetic tests to determine the DNA fingerprint of individual batches of anthrax had not been developed. The FBI sought out the best experts in the scientific community, and over time, 4 highly sensitive and specific tests were developed that were capable of detecting the unique qualities of the anthrax used in the 2001 attacks. That is to say, this investigation took our agents and scientists to new territory. An extraordinary amount of research and testing needed to achieve these groundbreaking accomplishments required months and years of trial and error analysis and review. We were then able to trace that to an individual lab, a single flask, and one individual who controlled it. Further, painstaking investigation led us to the conclusion that Dr. Bruce E. Ivins was responsible for the death, sickness, and fear brought to our country by the 2001 anthrax mailing, and that it appears, based on the evidence, that he was acting alone. In closing, I sincerely hope that the documents we have released today provide an overview of our investigation of the 2001 anthrax mailings, our scientific accomplishments, and the conclusion made regarding Dr. Ivins. Thank you.
We're happy to take some questions.
Can you explain, please, why you would tell a target or someone that you believe that he is a killer who had a weapon of mass destruction, and then allow that person continued access to a lab where he would still have potentially access to similar kinds of substances?
With respect to the access he actually had, I'll defer to the Department of Defense. However, when the investigation began to focus on Dr. Ivins, the lab was notified of our concerns about him. With respect to what was done after that, I'll refer you to the Department of Defense. Jim.
Question for Mr. Persicini. This is obviously, at this point, a circumstantial case you feel is a strong circumstantial case. What direct evidence do you have? For instance, do you have any tape that was used on the envelope that was recovered from his home? Do you have any other evidence that clearly would link him? For instance, in the affidavit, it mentions that people of this sort often keep souvenirs. Did you find anything like that at his home?
Well, first I'm going to refer back to the documents, because that's the purpose of our press conference today, to provide you the documents and the information pertaining to the documents. As it relates to admitting evidence into it, I'm going to refer back to Jeff. But again, we're looking at the document itself and the purpose of our release and providing this information to the families. That's first and foremost for us. So I won't discuss the actuality of evidence then.
Let me talk for a minute about the circumstantial evidence notion, direct evidence. As I just laid out, there's plenty of evidence in this case of all types. We have a flask that's effectively the murder weapon from which those spores were taken that was controlled by Dr. Ivins. Anthrax in that flask was created by Dr. Ivins. We have the suspicious behavior that he had undertaken over the years. We have, in addition, the mail envelopes with the tool stamp defects I had mentioned. But again, back to circumstantial evidence. Thousands of prosecutors and thousands of courthouses across this country every day prove cases beyond a reasonable doubt using circumstantial evidence. In fact, the standard jury instruction given by judges across the country is that a jury can consider circumstantial evidence and direct evidence, and they both can be given equal weight depending on the jury's view. So again, circumstantial evidence, sure, some of it is, but it's compelling evidence, and our view is we are confident it would have helped us prove this case against Dr. Ivins beyond a reasonable doubt. Yes?
Okay, when did you guys get back around to him? Now, reading the documents, it said June 17, 2004, the FBI discovered that the strains matched the flask. Then we got back to him about 9 months later and told him that, and he lied and said that an FBI agent had told him that later. So clearly by then it sounded like he was actually trying to lead you guys astray. He'd already given you, false specimens, those kinds of things. When did you get back around to him from March 31st of 2005 as the suspect?
It's important to remember how complex and complicated this investigation was. At the outset, we had to identify the universe of persons and labs that might have access to this type of anthrax. Once we identified what type of anthrax it was, and then over the years, there were efforts to shrink the size of that pool. One of the key steps was the science that the FBI was able to develop that over time allowed them to show that that flask, RM1029, was the parent flask for the spores used in those envelopes. That further shrunk the pool, if you will, and created additional interest in Dr. Ivins. But even at that point, the investigation still had a long way to go, because there's still a universe of people who might have access to that flask, or people with whom Dr. Ivins may have shared some portion of that anthrax. The initial science breakthrough, if you will, came in early 2005 in terms of having validated science that could be used to show the flask was the parent, science that could be used at trial, that could lead to admissible evidence. Then in 2007, as we conducted additional investigative steps, we were able to narrow the focus even further, exclude individuals, and that left us looking at Dr. Ivins.
Eric, so there was at least a 2-year delay between the forensic evidence leading to Fort Detrick and really focusing on Dr. Ivins. How big a factor was Dr. Hatfill in that, and how did the FBI get so off track in focusing on him, apparently as the sole and primary suspect?
Let me refer back to what I said. It was an extensive investigation. In an investigation of this scope and complexity, the task is to follow the evidence where it leads. The science breakthrough in 05 leads you to flask RMR1029. At that point, as I said, there is a tremendous amount of additional investigation that needs to take place to identify the universe of individuals who had access to that flask, what they did with it, checking lab books, doing interviews, things of that nature, and only through taking those extensive, time-consuming steps involving a lot of agents were they able to exclude individuals and include others, in particular Dr. Ivins.
Dr. Hatfill, can you address that?
Again, the evidence that they followed where it led, that's all I'm prepared to say on that at this point.
Dr. Hatfill was never established to have access in the bacteriology division or possession, obviously, of anthrax yet. His residence was searched in June of 2002. Further searches of his properties were conducted throughout that year and beyond, yet it took until, if I'm reading your documents correctly, late 2007 before you ever sought to search Bruce Ivins' vehicles or his residence. Can you just speak to that gap, and did you determine whether Dr. Ivins ever had his vehicle cleaned or bleached in the intervening 6 years?
I've talked already about the extensive investigation that took place from 2005 to 2007. Again, we're talking about a large number of individuals, over 100, who potentially had access to this substance. We had to go through this laborious process to ferret out or exclude those who were not involved. With respect to the other individual you mentioned, we were able to determine that at no time could that individual be put in the presence of that flask from which these spores came.
Did you determine that?
Jeff, did you find any handwriting samples or hair samples that would have matched Dr. Ivins to the envelopes or the hair samples that were found in the mailbox?
We did not find any handwriting analysis or hair samples in the mailbox, so there was no forensics of that part.
Did you take handwriting samples from Dr. Ivins?
We examined handwriting samples, but then there was no comparison made or a specific identification of the handwriting. And it appears that if the analyst would look at it, that there was an attempt to disguise the handwriting, so it was unable to make a comparison.
Let me say, with respect to handwriting samples, we did have indications from individuals with whom we spoke that there appeared to be some similarities in handwriting that were apparent. That said, we did not have a scientifically valid conclusion that we thought would lead us to be able to admit that in evidence.
Could you speak a little bit about what he said in an email a couple of days before the letters went out regarding Al-Qaeda having some kind of biological weapons or sarin gas or anthrax to this quality? There was some mention in the affidavits about it, and then
Yes,
it's compared to the letters?
That's correct. There was an email at the time that mentioned that factor, and we put it in to suggest, among other things, some possible connection between what he was describing about death to Israel, death to America, and what was found in the letters that had been mailed in the attacks.
Is that a strong connection, do you think?
It's circumstantial evidence. Yes.
Do you think there's a connection between Ivins and what was known at the time as the Quantico letter? That was a letter sent in September of 2001 identifying an Arab-American scientist at Fort Detrick as bioterrorist. The letter also threatened a bioterror attack and also death to Israel. Were you ever satisfied that you were able to run down that